Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this timely session on gender diversity in finance. Where are we today? I am Babak Abbaszadeh, CEO of Toronto Centre for Global Leadership and Financial Supervision. I would like to express our gratitude to BLG for generously hosting this event in their beautiful offices. This underscores the firm's commitment to this issue. I also like to thank Ilana Singer, the chair of the Toronto Centre's Securities Advisory Board, who has spearheaded this, and thank the advisory board as well. So you might be asking, who's the Toronto Centre? You probably haven't heard about the Toronto Centre before. We're kind of like those jazz players in the 30s in Europe, like we're much better known outside of Canada, and you'll find out in a second. Toronto Centre was established in 1998 as a non-profit organization to promote sound financial governance and stability and financial inclusion. Since inception, we have trained more than 10,000 central bankers, supervisors, and regulators in all sectors of financial services in over 190 countries and territories. This is not the first time we are shining the spotlight on promoting gender diversity in finance. Our primary interest is in developing countries where more than 1 billion women do not have access to financial services. Redressing the financial inclusion gap can lead to women's economic empowerment and poverty alleviation. Our mission supports Canadian government's new international development priorities set out in the Feminist International Assistance Policy by the Honorable Marie-Claude Bibeau, the Minister of International Development, last June. Our mission is also consistent with the United Nations 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. But we also know that gender equality challenges are worldwide, including here in Canada and other OECD countries. Last April, at the spring meetings of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, we organized an executive panel to discuss closing the gender gap in finance. In August, we posted a related webcast that included an interview with Maureen Jensen. Maureen? Okay, great. Thank you. And also earlier this month, we published a paper, The Business Case for Promoting Improved Gender Balance in Financial Institutions, authored by Jennifer Reynolds. Jennifer, great. We encourage you to visit our website to learn more about these excellent resources. In a growing number of countries, financial regulators are at the forefront of encouraging or requiring greater participation by women in leadership roles in the corporate domain. There is a growing recognition that this is not only a social justice issue, but that there is a strong business case in promoting diversity in boardrooms and executive leadership, especially considering that more women than men are graduating from universities lately. This is an important issue to positively affect the bottom line. There are a variety of international approaches to addressing the gender gap. They range from instituting quotas to complying and explaining disclosure measures. So this is the right panel to address these and many other complex issues. I should thank our funders for generously supporting the Toronto Centre. They include the Global Affairs Canada, the Swedish International Development Agency, and the International Monetary Fund. We also remain indebted to two of our original founders, the World Bank Group and the Schulich School of Business. Also, a big thanks to Toronto Centre staff for putting up with me and also helping with this event. Now, you have seen the bios of the speakers and the moderators, so I'm not going to read that. I'm not going to be able to justice to it, but I'm just going to give a couple of highlights about each. Maureen is the chair and CEO of the Ontario Securities Commission, and she was also a senior VP at IROC before she came to the OSC. Jennifer Reynolds is the new president and CEO of Toronto Financial Services Alliance. Congratulations, Jennifer. And formerly president and CEO of Women in Capital Markets. And also my board colleague on the Toronto Centre's board is Ilana Singer. As I mentioned, she's the chair of the Securities Advisory Board of the Toronto Centre. She's also the vice president and corporate secretary at the Canadian Investors Protection Fund. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Ilana for the event. And thanks again for everyone for coming.
Okay, so I don't know which mic, is this fine? Okay, good. All right, well, thank you, Babak, and good afternoon. I'm delighted to welcome you all to this incredible event and to be in the presence of such wonderful women. It's exciting to have the Toronto Centre branch out into the financial services community with this lunchtime session, which is quite inaugural. Today, we'll focus on a timely topic that has become even more relevant in our industry: gender, diversity, and inclusion. Now, often when we speak about gender diversity and inclusion in capital markets, we perceive the Canadian C-suites and boardrooms to be at the forefront in advancing this issue. But we would be wrong in our thinking. The data really does tell a different story. And we have a lot of work to do. I think a lot of that came through loud and clear during the recent roundtable that was hosted by the OSC on Tuesday. I was unfortunately not able to attend. I was out of town. But I see and I'm delighted to see a number of the roundtable participants here today. From a business perspective, as Babak said, studies have shown that a higher representation of women on boards and in senior leadership roles can lead to stronger financial performance by firms. So how do we get there? Now, in the spirit of finding innovative solutions, our two esteemed panelists will take the lead in sharing their thoughts on how to move the dial forward on this critical question. Maureen and Jennifer, standing to my left, have been champions on this question, and I'm proud that as chair of Toronto Centre's Securities Advisory Board, I've been able to drive this conversation forward. Now, in terms of flow for today, I'll be posing 3 rounds of questions to each of Maureen and Jennifer, and then, towards the end, we'll invite questions from you, the audience, and we really do want this to be an interactive, interesting dialogue during the course of this event. I'll provide brief closing remarks, and then, as Babak said, this is intended to last an hour, so we will wrap up at 1 o'clock. Thank you, and here we go. So we're going to start, Maureen, with some questions about what I alluded to earlier with respect to the recent OSC roundtable and the recently released OSC report on gender diversity in boardrooms and senior leadership roles for women. Are there any key themes that you would want this group to retain, both from the report and from the roundtable that you recently conducted?
Okay, I'll start. So we had a really great roundtable on Tuesday, and Tanya Van Biesen was there, and Judy Cott was there. Thanks, Judy. And we had a wonderful interactive discussion. A lot of people didn't agree. So we were really talking about what happened over the last 3 years and where are we going. So let's just talk about what happened over the last 3 years. So we started at 49% of boards in Canada had a woman on the board. That's where we started 3 years ago. Our study shows that after 3 years of reporting on this issue and talking about it, it has moved to 61% of boards have at least one woman on the board. But if you look at the flip side of that, it means 39% of boards on the TSX still do not have a single woman on the board. And if you look at, this is really not, we don't think that moved the needle a lot. One area that we know moved the needle was the number of seats that are now being filled by women as they're vacated. And that went up from something in the 10 to 11% range. It went up to about 26% of the seats were being filled by women. So 1 in 4. So that meant that we're seeing an uptake on that. Still, we only have, it's 14% of the board seats are filled by women in this country on the TSX. And so, that really, we have not moved the needle very much over the last 3 years. So that was disappointing. What we are quite pleased about is that we have seen this uptick in the number of women going onto the boards. And we have seen an uptick in the number of companies that are actually talking about setting a target or having a policy. Those boards seem to perform quite well and add more women to their boards. But there's still the whole discussion going on in the community about what's the business case to do this. And I have to say, I was quite happy at the round table, and the 2 participants that are here, you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that people are getting frustrated and saying, enough is enough, it's got to move. It's got to move faster. And also, I was pleasantly surprised to hear that many people were saying, let's not just talk about the business case, let's call this out for what it is. It's plain discrimination. And so I was quite surprised that there was a strong support for this in the roundtable. And actually, that position was put forward by the chair of a mining company. And so we're starting to see some progress, but it's not going fast enough. I will say that we were canvassing, what do we do next? 3 years, we've had comply and explain, and we've moved the needle a little bit. Should we do more? And there was a solid consensus in the room that we should do more. We shouldn't just continue to do what we're doing today, that we have to still push and move this needle. And so there was a lot of discussion about setting targets, asking companies to set targets and publicly set them. So even if they want to set them at 0, then they have to explain why they set the target that way. And then they'll be measured against their target. There was a lot of consensus around some guidelines to help people get to start moving this needle. But there also was a disappointment, I think, that we still have 39% of companies on the TSX that haven't even considered this issue. And I would say from staff's point of view, they have a deep knowledge of every single one of these companies that was in the sample set and have looked at what they say about whether they set a target and whether they have a policy. And I think the most disappointing thing is that we still see many companies saying that they only hire and promote on merit, and they can't find any women of merit. And that, I would say, quite frankly, is very disappointing after this full discussion that we've had.
Thank you, Maureen. It sounds like it was a really interesting discussion and
It was,
candid.
yeah, it was very great. And we also talked a little bit about term limits. So you only have an opportunity to consider another gender on your board if you have turnover. And that we have a problem in this country in that there are many boards who still believe that it is okay to sit on a board for 20 and 30 years. And Eileen Mercier was on the panel, and she said something fabulous. She said, I don't understand why there's a difficulty with term limits. She said, after 10 years, you've got my best ideas. It's time to move on. And so, there's a real reticence to set some kind of board turnover, whether it's term limits or age limits. But we're never going to crack this nut about moving women on boards to a 30% or a 40% target if we don't have more turnover. So that's very important. And there was quite a good discussion on how do you actually measure board effectiveness, and how do you measure director effectiveness? And so we had some discussion about that, but in general we were encouraged to put forward some good guidelines. So that's part of the consideration that we will now move forward to discuss with our CSA colleagues on where do we go from here. But I would say that it was a really good roundtable. The last one we had was 3 years ago. And was it 3 years ago, Joanne? 2 years ago. And we've moved past the why should we do this? It's now how do we actually move the needle? And let's stop talking about it and start seeing some action.
Maureen, were there any discussions? I noticed in a recent article, this is a bit off script, but I'll ask in any event. There was a recent article that I read from Forbes about how the only way to move the needle forward would be through compensating for diversity policies and making that a metric, making that part of a senior executive's or a chair's compensation package. Was there any discussion about that?
There was a whole discussion about what gets measured gets done. And so the only way that you can actually incent the appropriate behavior anywhere, no matter what business you're in, is you incent people to have a certain outcome. There's always perverse outcomes because of incentives as well, so you have to be careful. But the discussion is put it in the goals, put it in the targets, and compensate accordingly.
Thank you. I understand there were also some discussions about professionalizing the board recruitment process.
Yes.
And how that could help as well in terms of increasing
Yeah.
diversity.
Well, yeah, what we're talking about here is a cultural issue. This is not, bad people trying to hold on to their power, even though people never give up power. But this is really about, I'm comfortable talking to people that I can actually anticipate what their thought process would be, and that they will be fair to me and I'll be fair to them. And the way to do that is to sit around the table with people who all went to the same school and talk like you and maybe have the same background in education. But what we have to do is we have to get better at allowing for informed, contentious dialogue in a very professional way. And so when you talk about the recruitment side, what we find are the vast majority of boards, other than big boards, large companies, the vast majority of boards are really recruited from people's own network. And so it can be your professional network, it can be your private friend network as well, because you're certain that you can sit and have a collegial conversation and discuss issues, and you won't have people challenging each other in a really negative way. So, the vast majority won't go through a consultant, a search firm, because they just can't afford it. But what we're seeing now is more and more boards, and certainly on our own board, we have really had a complete rethink of our skills matrix. And we are looking for very different kinds of skills than we did in the past. It's not just education and experience. We're looking for those other things, the soft skills, the ability to communicate, the ability to bring other viewpoints to the table. And so that generally comes with different genders and different colors of faces at the table.
Thank you, Maureen. Jennifer, I know that you were not able to attend the roundtable, but would you like to comment on any of what was discussed that you've just heard was discussed, and the themes that arose from the roundtable and also from the October 5th OSC report?
Yeah, I guess maybe I'll give a bit of context, and many people in the room have this context, but when we think, go back to 2013 when this whole consultation paper was put out, and we started thinking about this, and thank you to the OSC and Maureen and your colleagues for starting the dialogue. I think there was this feeling, people were feeling positive about Comply or Explain generally. When we started that dialogue and you got your letters in, there was only, there was some, OTPP, Jim Leach put forward the concept of quotas at that time.
That's right.
But I think, generally people said, no, Comply or Explain, this is the right thing, this can work here in Canada. And unfortunately, Maureen's just given us the to my mind, very disappointing statistics here. We should have done a lot better. We're just not seeing that adoption, sort of that cultural adoption of this is really important to us. And it really, that buy-in to the business case, that idea that diversity does matter at the boardroom table, that having our buddies there is not going to be the best end result. And so that's created frustration. And I'm sure, though I wasn't there, I'm sure there was some frustration voiced at the round table.
There was a lot of it.
Yeah, and I've been hearing that, certainly in my role with Women in Capital Markets, just the tones changed dramatically over, in particular the last couple of years as, with these reports coming out. And so the question is what next, as was being discussed. And quotas is, always that word that comes up is, do we need quotas? Is that the only thing that's going to work? That's, I believe, what Jim Leach has said. He said, listen, we're going to end up here anyway, so why don't you just jump right to it?
Right.
And so that's, to my mind, it's amazing how quickly people's views can change around, I talked to some women who 3 years ago would say, there is no way that I am for quotas. And now they're saying to me, you know what, I'm really surprised I'm saying this, but I'm sick and tired of it. Let's just go for quotas because nothing's going to change here. So I think that's a big change over a 3-year period. And I'm not saying everyone feels that way, but there's just a bit of a wave there. And that's frustration speaking. And so the question is, what's in between, hopefully, quotas and where we are today?
Right.
How can we force that cultural adoption? I think the point on compensation is an important one, and I've had many dialogues with not just boards on this, but in the financial institutions really have focused on this. Large institutions more broadly, but financial institutions have been focused on this perhaps for longer than others for different reasons. They were forced to in some cases, in terms of some disclosure they had to make, but. So they've been working at this not just at the board level, but further down, because this isn't just about boards. This is about how are we going to get more women in executive suites. How that's and that's the one we don't get enough airtime to, right? But we're starting with the board, and I understand why. But those bigger companies are starting to focus on that, and then the dialogue comes up. Well, if it's not changing, how do we hold people accountable? And I am a firm believer that people will deliver on what they're paid for. That's what they're going to do. So if you don't pay them for something, they're not going to do that. That's just the way, that's human nature. That's the way the business world works. So we're starting to see in certain institutions that diversity component in performance for managers. Are they getting dinged in their compensation on it yet? I would argue no.
No,
not
they're
yet.
not.
It's in there in some, but we need, until we get there, until it really is, when you come forward to the promotion table or with your slate and you don't have any women on it, time after time after time, suddenly that becomes something that is a negative in terms of how people look at your performance.
Yeah.
And activist shareholders, we've had a couple weigh in on that front, so we need more of that at the board level. That's how we make it happen overnight.
Yeah,
right?
and we had a good discussion about that at the roundtable as well. First of all, on the women in senior management, absolutely. If we don't have more women in senior management, this is just a conversation that's just not going to have the talent ready for that next level. And that is the most disappointing number.
Yes.
That's moved by 2% in 3 years.
Yeah.
And it goes up and down. And I will tell you that that number's gamed a bit, because it's not just the women who are reporting to the CEO. They are considering this as a broader management team. Mm-hmm. So it includes 2 levels. So the picture's even worse.
And where the women are as well. And
Yes.
not to degenerate certain areas, but we need people in profit and loss roles to actually get to CEO positions.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And your other point was, I've just lost it now.
It was compensation.
Yeah,
both levels. And
yeah,
the cultural change.
The cultural change, it's not happening.
Yeah.
It really isn't. And about women on slates. One way to get women on boards is to always say that if you're going to have a slate for your final slate to move forward for your final interviews, you should always have 50-50 on that, or at least some women and some men, right? Mm-hmm. So we're not seeing that at all.
Yeah.
Right? In the inside the executive ranks, it's almost always just male candidates that are put forward, except on boards that have 2 or 3 women on the board. They start asking for, where are the women on this slate? I want to at least interview one. And then things start changing.
Yeah, we need those more women in the head of, the chair of nominating governance roles and those types of things to make that happen.
And there was a really great discussion about ISS. Someone from ISS, Deborah Sisti, was on the panel and talked about what ISS is doing. And they have been monitoring the situation, and they're hearing from many of their institutional clients now that they want to have more of a discussion about gender diversity in their voting instructions. And so what they've heard is, and we asked her that question directly, is, are they going to act on it? Or are they just going to put the information in their service? And she says that she thinks they are going to act on it, and they're going to start voting, recommending no votes for companies that have no diversity. And Judy talked about the fact that it is in their voting matrix for RBC Asset Management, and that if they don't see a diverse slate, or at least diverse candidates for the board, they will vote against. So we're starting to see some movement, but it has to be movement at the board, senior management, institutional shareholders.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other dynamic, and it's highlighted in the report, is Canada is an economy of small, medium-sized businesses, right? So the numbers for those companies which are less than $1 billion in market cap are very different from the TSX 60. And that's something that really speaks volumes about what is the culture in Canada today. because those are the vast majority of companies, of people working, are in those other companies. And so that's worrisome to me, that they haven't, we haven't seen bigger uptake there, and the numbers, haven't moved there. And the thought that 35% of boards today will openly disclose that they don't consider gender at all in their appointments, and 40%, don't consider it in the executive suite. That just goes to show, how different the perspective is if you're sitting in a large corporation and having this, hopefully fairly evolved dialogue relative to working in a smaller company. And everyone always calls it the resource sector, but the numbers aren't very good there. And technology, thank God, they're bad, but we've seen at least a little of improvement there on some fronts. But we need to think about that and how we're really going to change. That cultural element is going to change. And I don't know if there's anything you can do about this, but if we could just disallow people saying they only appoint based on merit, because just reading that one more time is just killing me.
You should see the faces of the staff when they read that kind of thing.
I'm sure.
Yeah, right. I mean, that doesn't resonate at all. And we have a productivity gap here in Canada, and I think part of it is because you really, senior management of all of these companies, big and small, really only look at 50% of the population when they come to recruiting talent. And it's really, really disappointing.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm jumping ahead a little bit, I guess, Ilana, but
We're taking over.
Yeah, exactly. Just keep talking.
My role is done.
I do find it, as a Canadian, disappointing when we think about, there's been studies recently about, how are we stacking up? And, when you think about things like productivity, your comment, made me think of the study by McKinsey that came out that looked at, if we had better gender equality in the workforce and in the economy, there's $150 billion in increased GDP over the next 7 or 8 years. And where does that come from? Part of it is certainly women in different types of professions. So about 42% of that was attributed to we need more women in STEM. So higher productivity jobs, higher paying jobs, those jobs which do lead to the executive suite and to boards. But where we've stagnated, unfortunately, and the report made the comment that we've really stagnated over the last 2 decades, and in labor participation rates. And we actually used to rank quite well globally, and we've gone down in the rankings. And so labor participation rates were sort of another 42% of, we've got to improve that here in Canada. So I find it, never mind the board dialogue, but just generally, why are women falling behind globally in Canada from an economic perspective relative to our OECD peers? We all need to be concerned about that and think about that more broadly. So that goes to that executive suite dialogue, certainly. And if we look around the globe and just look at the board numbers, and I talked quotas earlier, so those countries, if you look at Scandinavia, if you look at many places in Europe, you're going to see numbers, 30 to 40% in terms of board representation. So that's the quota happening. However, we've also seen, and unfortunately we see Canada then at the very bottom of the chart at 14%.
And we're going down.
To be. Because others are obviously going up a lot faster. I think we all know in the room, UK has had a lot more success with Comply or Explain, and I don't know if that was commented on. I think there was a lot of other momentum outside of just the Comply or Explain.
Yes, because they had a very respected and senior member of business, Lord Davies, who actually challenged all of the CEOs and the chairs to actually start looking at women on boards. And so that was, basically they were shamed into it. I want to make a point, though, about quotas. So quotas actually do move the needle. There's no question about it. But the problem is they only move the needle to the quota. And so the problem that they found in Scandinavia was they definitely made their targets because they had to. They were basically told, if you don't make the target, you're going to get delisted. So actually what happened was, almost a third of the companies, they actually went private, so they wouldn't have to change their boards. And so they self-selected out. And of those left, everybody made the target. But the target was 40% of women on the board, but not a single chair was a woman, and that did not move the needle at all at the senior management level. So what gets measured gets done. There's no question. So I think, quotas are, it's like a sledgehammer, but it only affects that one number.
Yeah, and I think the other comment that was made about that particular case as well is that what we saw was a number of women in Norway just become overboarded. So it was really just a very small number of women who benefited from being on multiple boards, and we didn't see that cultural change.
That's right.
You know, to make it more pervasive.
And that happened in France and other places as well. Ended up that the wives and the daughters of the chairman were on the board, and actually it happened here in restaurant brands.
Yeah.
Right? First of all, they said no women at all, and then they were kind of shamed into it, and then it was the chairman's daughter that was appointed. Very, very credible candidate outside of that, but that was the only person of merit that they could find. So that's really disappointing. It says a lot. You know, I just came from a session with our staff about trust, and essentially the disappointing thing about this is, by not being able to appoint women on a board, they're actually saying to all women, we don't trust you. Mm-hmm. And that is a difficult message to get.
Mm-hmm. Were there discussions, I'm going off script, but were there discussions during the roundtable about how to, in terms of shifting the culture, how to frame the question a little differently so that it's not a women's question? You spoke to the issue of making the business case for it, which I think is valid, and there are so many studies, and you've cited a number of them as well. But were there discussions about how to, make this more palatable, even beyond the compensation piece, but from a cultural shift perspective, how to reframe it?
There were discussions about unconscious bias. There were discussions about maybe we should broaden this to include a broader diversity discussion, which absolutely this is the path that we're on. But I have to say that we're worried about opening it up too much, because I'm afraid of what's going to happen, or something similar to that happened in the United States, where they opened up, they said it can't be just gender, it has to be all of the diversity targets discussed. And they have spent the last 15, 20 years discussing what is diversity, how do you measure it, tell me how I'm going to measure ethnicity and all of that, what are the measures for an appropriate level, and they've actually made no progress. And so I think you have to have focus if you want to make progress.
Yeah,
And
I agree.
Yeah, and everything that we do around gender is equally applicable to broader diversity. And it's just, I think it's just that next step.
Yeah.
And women come with all kinds of backgrounds as well.
One question, I know you talked about targets at the round table, and this is something, I mean, my view is I think companies should just have to have targets, period. You can pick your own target, but put your target out there and then report on how you're doing on your target. And if you're not meeting it, why aren't you meeting it? I just think people's feet do need to be held to the fire a little bit. And you're choosing your own target there. It also does allow for that shaming that we saw in the UK to happen. And I know that I've had the comment before that that's very un-Canadian to shame people. We don't do that in Canada. I'm, shame away as far as I'm concerned.
That's a good line.
I don't think it'll move until people really do feel embarrassed about this. And clearly, they don't feel embarrassed because they're hiding behind these ridiculous merit comments and things like this. So, I don't know is it a Lord Davies report? I don't know if that was discussed at all, but I really think in some way, we have to get to a point where you just have to report and you have to have a target.
So on reporting, all of the data that we have collected by company, every single target, every single question that we ask them, it's all compiled on a large Excel spreadsheet, and it's on our website. Anyone can download it. You can sort it any which way you want. You can sort it by industry and size of company, whatever. And the most important thing is to take that and start having conversations. But we were having a quick chat earlier about calling out name and shame. Mm-hmm. And we have a really small economy, like tiny, and we all know each other. And so that collegiality, it makes people really nervous to call people out. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but it has to be done.
Yeah, and I think I think that's one of the reasons we're not moving faster, though, is that it is so small and clubby, and then you've got the clubs within industries. There's some cross-fertilization there, but it does make it very hard to push your friends on this front.
Yeah.
I see that we have a question from the audience. Are you
Sure.
fine with that? Okay, yes, go ahead, Ellen.
Whether or not the roundtable talked at all about the fact that the liquidity shift in Canada is moving towards more women, and whether or not the clients, the consumers of whatever these companies are providing with these services or goods, whether or not we could reach out to the end user to put the pressure on low. You know, I'm not going to buy such and such brand because their board is not. I know that's a lot of education, it's a lot
Yeah,
of people
it
to
is.
reach out to, but as a service provider, you know, I remember when I was in big law firms, when the banks would say something like, you know, we want to see a senior woman on your team. And we mean it. We don't want to see somebody who's just a woman on your team. We actually want to see her working and
Yeah.
reading the files. And that was a very powerful statement coming from the end user.
Right, and I think that's right. There was a great article in the paper today written by the Canadian, did you bring it?
I brought
Yeah,
it.
I brought it too. Yeah, by the CEO of Hewlett-Packard. And it talks about a lot of things in there, and a lot of them we've talked about on the government committee on trying to move the needle forward on women. One of them is, in your procurement decisions, say that you will preferentially look at firms that have women on their boards or in senior management. There's a lot of decisions that people make in their corporate daily life that you can have a consumer, you can have an impact as a consumer by just starting the conversation.
We need to put it on people's radar.
Yes.
That's the challenge, I guess.
Yeah.
I think you know what people need to understand is every tiny step like that though does make a difference,
Yep.
right? And often we think, oh, what I do daily doesn't make a difference, and you know, like I don't invest in companies that don't have women on their boards. That's not going to move the market, but that's what I'm doing. And if everybody though all of a sudden does that, then that adds up eventually. And so we need to recognize that collective power, I think.
Yeah.
Do you broadcast that investment decision?
Yes, I do. Yeah, absolutely.
See, that's the key part of it, because I don't think that message is coming through. If I make a decision of that sort, and it's a personal decision, unless there's some PR attached to that, or a message directly to somebody that you would otherwise buy, the incentives
Yep.
aren't there.
Yep.
Hashtag needs something, not that needs something.
Yeah, we have to get vocal about the issue.
Yeah.
You know, we talked a little bit, I just mentioned restaurant brands. So I've been boycotting Tim Hortons since they made that stupid statement that they wouldn't put women on their boards. But I'll give you an example. One of the assistants in our office, she was talking to a good friend of hers who was in marketing, a junior person in marketing, and she went for a job interview and was offered the job at Tim Hortons. And that was just when the board issue came out. And she turned them down and said, I don't want to work at a company where I can't see myself being able to move up. And that's really hard for someone who's, you know, new and looking for their first gig. But that's what it's going to take.
I think it's about brand, to your point. Like it has to start impacting people's brand in some way. And you know, social media is powerful, but it's how do we get enough people on that bandwagon on particular issues? We haven't seen that kind of activism, I guess, amongst individuals, which I do think is something we should explore. I know obviously the best world is, or the fastest end game is if the institutional investors just demand this, and it happens a lot faster. But there's other ways.
Yeah, and I think people are self-selecting. They are going to companies where they can see that there's a chance for them to get ahead, which means that the talent starts moving, and eventually it will be very, very difficult. And I know them, you know, for example, my background way back is in mining. And about 10 years ago, the mining industry started an enormous campaign to actually start finding people who would work in the mining industry. One, they had for years turned away women, and so there were very few women in the senior ranks. But on top of that, they had started to lose their social license. No one wanted to go work for a mining company. And so they are in such a skills gap right now that when they lose executives because they don't have an opportunity to move forward, it's really hard to replace them. And that's what's going to happen.
It will, and you see that in the technology field too, where they're not attracting female graduates to the types of degrees where they need, and they're short on skilled
Right.
labor. Even in the financial sector, I mean, it used to be that it was a lot cooler 20 years ago to go work in the financial sector.
Yeah, nobody wants to work at the banks
Nobody wants to
anymore.
work in a bank anymore. So everybody's sort of feeling that, talent is a key issue right now. It's very important, and there is a fight for good, strong talent. And if you're ignoring 62% of the graduates, I just think that's dumb
Yeah,
business.
it is. Yeah, it means that your collective pool of talent is that much poorer. And so and the only way to do that is to start demonstrating that there are people in the company that women can see themselves becoming.
I see we have one other question in the audience.
This notion, this conversation of diversity and inclusion is starting to hit a bit of a crescendo in Canada, certainly in North America, which is good. And Maureen, you pointed to board management and institutional investors being key to moving the dial. I think there's an element that we're all missing, and it's perhaps a contrarian view. We women are not so supportive of women.
That's true.
There is a presiding perspective that I worked really hard to get here, and you shouldn't have it any easier.
Yeah.
With all due respect, men, even who are not friends, will champion each other. And women internally, we continue to see the same highly qualified faces on Canadian boards. Is it not incumbent upon us and those women on boards, when they're asked to reach out to their network, to not go to the same sources?
Yep.
We have women on boards here, we have Move the Dial, we have all of these lists. Women's Executive Network, keeping these lists of qualified women who are never getting a phone call. Because the women who are the gatekeepers who have already gotten on these boards aren't thinking about anybody outside of their own circle. So frankly, we're no better than, with all due respect, the old white men's network
No.
that rules all of our boards.
You're absolutely right.
How do we get women to champion each other? How, there's tons of networking, and frankly, that's a word that just has become sour. We need more than networking. We need championing of each other.
Yep.
We need to get to know each other. So what are you looking for? What are you looking for? What's your desirable board? What are the skills that you bring to the table so that I can champion a woman when I find out that some board is looking for someone? How do we open those gates?
Well,
That's a great question.
my view on that is I hope there's been a bit of a generational shift between, call it those women who are on boards, 60s, 65, relative down, sub 50. The research will show you that, if you're that one person who made it to the top, there's an element of something called covering. So you disassociate yourself with whatever gender,
Yes.
ethnicity, et cetera. So I do think, you go back, you think of women who are, in their 60s, 70s who have gone through the business world. They were the only one, right? So there would have been that element of covering. Does it still go on? Yes, it does, for sure. I think it's getting somewhat better, but I do agree with you completely that women on boards, and maybe it's unfair of us to hold them to a higher standard and say you have to help everyone else, but yeah, you do have to help everyone else because that's part of the solution.
People continue to go to the same well over and over. And, there's been a lot of discussion about mentoring, but I think you're right, it's champion, right? Look down in your organization. Look at the people that are really doing well, men or women, and help them. Champion them to other people and say, this person will be a great board member in 10 years. Let's invest.
One thing I think men are better at, and just my personal observation, I don't have any research on this, is taking a risk on their friends. Even if they have a male colleague who hasn't been on a board before, or it might be a stretch to go on that particular board, they'll push them forward. And I think we actually, as women, also expect it. And there is research on women having to, have already achieved all the things versus being judged on potential. So I think we need to think about that and our own biases around who we're willing to recommend.
And we do have biases because we, a man will look at a job description and they'll say, oh, I can do 50% of that job. I'm definitely applying and doing that. But I've had women come to my office where I've said, you should apply for this job. You should do this. Well, there's about 10% of that job that I can't do. You can do it. Just do it. Take a risk.
So to your point, well articulated, I see that a lot. I am a serving corporate director. I have co-founded Women Get On Board. I'm the CEO, and I've had women say to me, I don't know why you are empowering other women to get on board. Why don't you just focus on your own corporate directorship? And I think my legacy I want to leave in life is that we all need to
You better pick Tanya. Her arm's going to fly off.
Yes. Thank you. That was a great comment. Yes, go ahead.
So I'm going to be, I'd like to offer a counterpoint to this. I think we as men and women have been subject to a ton of media on how women are mean to women, and actually the research does not show that. But experience does. Well, so I just said this to Sandra, there are assholes, and some of them are men, and some of them are women.
Oh, yeah. Yes, absolutely.
Again, and it comes back to what both Jennifer and Maureen said, we've been socialized to believe that we have to be nicer, and we have to help, and we have to be collaborative, and we have to lift the others up. You know what? Fuck that. We have to be good people, and men have to be good people too. So my legacy that I want to leave is that women are not burdened by this piece of we're not being nice to each other. Absolutely, I agree with you. We need to expand our networks. Everything that Maureen said, we've got to reach lower, we've got to do that. But men and women have to both do that. And I actually, in my job at Catalyst, I see a ton of women trying to reach across networks to find more women to get on board. And I just wish that we would all ignore those bullshit articles about women not helping women because it sells magazines, but I really think assholes come in both genders.
So I'd like to make a comment about that. Instead of just personality traits, I think what's happened is that we're suffering from kind of a 1940s or 50s view of what leadership looks like. And leadership is not just about top-down decisiveness. It's about leading people. It's about inspiring people to trust you. It's about all of those things that make it great to go to work and to take risks and to take them and to take them with impunity, actually, because that's the only way you can move forward. And so I think we're suffering from that as well. We're always looking back, what does a leader look like? Well, they're not all 6'2" white men in blue suits. I'll tell you that there's a lot of men who don't look like that and don't act like that and are more collaborative, and they didn't get ahead either. So this is about changing our definition of leadership.
I think we don't see that really permeates. One of my children made a comment, and I've mentioned this before. When I first got my job at Women in Capital Markets, it starts so young, is what I realized. They were saying, "What do you do?" I said, "Well, I'm the president." And one of my sons, who was 8 at the time, said, "What does a president do?" And so I started to talk about it, and then his younger brother, who was 7, said, "Wait a second. You can't be a president." And I said, "Why not?" And he said, "You're not a dude, you don't have gray hair, and you don't have a big chair." So in his mind, that's what a leader looks like. But I mention it because
Got that from TV.
Yeah, the media defines what a leader looks like. But I do think in the corporate world, we're still looking for that. So it really is pervasive. We need to start challenging that. We need role models at the end of the day.
Yeah, you need to see yourself.
Go ahead.
Sorry, having been a global executive for the lady in that article,
Yes. Okay, yes.
for Hewlett Packard.
Yes.
One of the things that we had at the corporation was actually a mandate, and it may not have been written by or in policy, but it was 25% of the executives had to be women. So by nature of that, then people had to bring women in. So there's your quota.
Yeah.
But let me tell you what happened. So they brought the women in, and then you started to see leadership grow. And actually, the last leadership team I was in, from a global perspective, we're talking multi-billion-dollar businesses, was 50% women.
Yep.
And then you look at the board of this company, right? And then leadership have been women. So, there's things that boards can do or executives
Yes.
and leadership can do to set quotas that bring the people up. And then when they bring the people up, you're starting to qualify them to get into the board position.
Yeah.
But you have to think ahead to do this. And this has been going on for years in that company.
Right. And you know what? They took the risk. They set a target and said, this is what we want to achieve. And it just blooms after you start doing that. We've seen the difference since we have a 50-50 board at the OSC. It's totally different. The discussions are truly about, merit. It's not just what does this one little narrow section of leadership look like, or I've been here, so many years.
I think my point is that maybe the quota shouldn't be set at board level. Why not set it at the executive level,
Yeah.
right?
They are actually, some institutions, like Hewlett-Packard and, certainly some of the banks, they're not publishing them though, necessarily. They don't want to publish them. But they actually, if you talk to executives, there are targets right now.
But they don't want to be held accountable publicly if they don't make it.
Yeah.
And I think this goes in part to Tanis's point about the PR around it. In other words, if large financial institutions were to make this public, admittedly there is the issue of not wanting to be held accountable to it. But if this became sort of a more grassroots or whatever you want to call it kind of push, it could lead to something bigger in the sense that.
But you can see if they have.
Right.
You can see it year after year because if they have set this as an important agenda item, you will see a change. And for the companies that you don't see a change, you don't need to inquire why. It's just they don't think it's important.
Babak, you had a question? Go
As
ahead.
an organizer, unfortunately, I can't use the F-bomb, but the question I have is, as I'm listening to this discussion, is interesting, is sobering. There's an element of melancholy in there, like just like things are not moving. But is this more like a plateau that we've reached, or is it kind of like an underbrush of fire that's just quiet and it's going to take off at some point? Like, are we going to get to the point where generational change is going to open the path?
I don't think it's generational change because it's self-fulfilling. Executives who have one view of leadership train the next generation to have the same view of leadership, and it's self-perpetuating. It's, when I started 40 years ago or so, and I was told, slow down, don't push too hard, it'll come. This generation of leadership will die off. Well, guess what? The next generation took over, and it was just the same. And so you have to call it out.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important point because you've got to be intentional. It won't change. My kids are going to be having the same dialogue, God forbid. My daughter said to me the other day that she wanted to be the CEO of Women in Capital Markets when she grew up, and I said, no, because this is going to be history by then. We have to, now is the time. It's not for the next generation. It's got to be everyone has a role, everyone has to do something, or we will be sitting here just having the same conversation.
And everybody wants to hire the best people, but the best people are not only in one gender. And so it's really important to look out there and look for good people.
But Maureen, you said earlier that what we're talking about in some ways is cultural. And I would say it is completely cultural. Because you have to persuade 49% of the population that they should give up their ingrained privilege for the benefit of the greater good, or the 51%, or the bottom line of their corporation, if you can convince them that that is in fact something that's of worth to them personally. I mean, the problem with a lot of this stuff is simply changing culture is wickedly difficult and takes a great deal of effort and concerted effort in a number of different dimensions all at the same time and in a consistent direction. And we don't do that very well.
No, we don't, because it's also done corporation by corporation and family by family.
To give an example, I've had a discussion with several people in this room about sexual harassment and the joys of being at an investment bank 35 years ago, and how you never got caught in a room with person X, usually one of the senior executives, between you and the door. And you never got caught with
Oh, that's scary. That's a whole other issue.
I mean, it went on for years and years and years, and it was sort of an open secret in most industries. Harvey Weinstein. Okay, all of a sudden it's a Me Too. It's a something. Is that going to last? Well, maybe. Maybe it's the equivalent of that, to raise the profile, to make people stop thinking this is just the way things work.
Yep.
The people who say it's merit, we promote on merit, their definition of merit lets out the 51% of the population. So how do we change the definition of merit in the minds of the people who are making the decisions?
Well, I think you call it out. What you do is you make it visible and transparent. This is, Tanis, this is not going to be something that's, the needle's going to move in 3 years and then we're done. But if you look back 30 or 40 years to what the cultural norms were then and what they are today, we've really come a long way. We have still to go a very long way. But I think the only thing to do it is just, we are half the population. Call it out.
I think young people have a big role to play too, because I always find it interesting because, I spend a lot of time in universities in both of my roles, and, it's so, number one, it's clearly there's more women graduating from universities, it's so diverse, and a lot of them come into the corporate world and are actually shocked at what they find on this front. And then unfortunately, though, they get sort of, they get corrupted by the whole environment.
They think they're living in an old movie.
Yeah, I think we have a lot to learn from the younger generation coming in, and let's try and fulfill what they would like to see and what they've seen in their life to date, and instead of showing them a whole different world, unfortunately, in the corporate world when they get there.
We have time for one more question. Judy, go ahead.
I agree with Maureen absolutely that there's a real problem in what we define as a leader and how women are perceived as fitting that role or not. And I think that's why the numbers seem so intractable at the executive level. And that's a really hard nut
It is.
to crack, because rolling out, and I think it's all a question of antiquated ideas of leadership, but connected with unconscious bias. And you can't, you can roll out unconscious bias training once a year. It's not even going to put a dent in the way that people perceive those things. But that's why I think the board is such a useful target of focus, because you have more levers at the board. You have institutional investors, you have regulators. It's more public, and I do believe once you get 3 or 4 women on the board, they're going to start to ask those questions of management and start to see that the executive team is all male. And that's probably going to be a more efficient way to drive the change in the management. Because that's where I think the biggest problem is, and you see it all the time, and it's quite insidious.
Yeah, I agree with you. And, I think to our earlier discussion around compensation, I just so firmly believe until people's compensation are impacted by, what kind of talent they're developing and who's on their board and those types of issues, we won't see a change. So board can drive that, right?
Yep.
Well,
Are we-
promised to get you out of here in 2 minutes, so I will provide some brief closing remarks now. Just wanted to thank both Maureen and Jennifer. Thank you. That was such a spirited discussion. And really, the participation from you is also what really made this so interesting. I think we talked about moving the dial. How can we do this? How quotas have worked to move the dial in other countries. How the shaming away policy in the UK helped in terms of moving that dial forward and driving the conversation forward in a more public way, in the public domain. How can that help in terms of all of us and others getting together to try to so that we're not having the same conversation in the same boardroom or in another boardroom in 20, 30 years or even in 10 years.
Oh, God, I hope not.
Right. I know. And, I think that a lot of the statistics that both you, Maureen, and you, Jennifer, cited were quite sobering in terms of how little progress we have made to date. On the other hand, I think there has been, as you said, Maureen, in terms of the cultural shift, there has been a real cultural shift in the last 30 to 40 years that you've witnessed. And a lot of the numbers are also, I think, not as sobering and point a better picture of success. For example, I think one of the statistics cited in the OSC report was that 57% of TSX-listed companies that had published targets had met them. So that is, a more, I think, uplifting statistic than some of the other ones that are a little more depressing, I suppose, for lack of a better word. We also talked about different characteristics of people of both genders, and I do think that when we talk about diversity, even though it can dilute the gender diversity concept, I think that at its core we're talking about diversity of thought, and we're talking about diversity of thought, bringing diverse thoughts and leadership styles to the table, both in senior leadership roles and at the board. And as Judy pointed out, having it at, focusing this attention on the board, as you've been doing and as we've been doing during this discussion, provides a lot of levers to financial institutions in our industry. And this article, which I would encourage many of you to read from today's Globe and Mail, was really interesting. I think one of the things, and this is from the president and CEO of Hewlett-Packard Canada, as Maureen mentioned, and you had mentioned that you were previously an executive at this organization.
Global, though, with Meg.
Oh,
Yes,
okay, I see.
with me, yeah.
Okay, but one of the really interesting quotes from it, which I think is very relevant for today, is, if you want to change how things are being done, take big, brave leaps. And in terms of legacies being left, and being change makers in our own worlds and in this industry. I think that's a really lovely mantra and a philosophy to live by. So again, I think I'm optimistic. We hopefully will see some big changes in the near future, or even in the next 5 to 10 years. But before we go, I want to thank, and I think we should all thank BLG for generously hosting us today. And a special thank you to Babak and his very talented team, many of whom were at the back and holding up signs saying 5 minutes, for their hard work in helping to organize this inaugural event. And as well as members, I also want to thank members of the Toronto Centre's Securities Advisory Board, one of whom is here today, Tanis McLaren, at the front. And I'd also like to acknowledge the president and CEO of CIPF, who's my boss, Roseanne Rizal, who's sitting at the front, who has been very supportive of the Toronto Centre and as, in my role as chair of their Securities Advisory Board. So thank you again to all of you for your participation today, and we do look forward to hosting you again and to continuing to drive this conversation forward. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.